This is a special edition of Sunday Focus, a public affairs program that looks at the topics affecting our society and the people who are making a change in the community each and every day. This special edition is presented by Information 1000 KSOO and Results Radio. This week, follow along as we educate and inform you on sex and labor trafficking. Now your host, Jeff Harkness.
I'm Jeff Harkness, and welcome to Part 3 of a special 5-part series on human trafficking in South Dakota. Part 3 is going to look at investigating trafficking in South Dakota, and we're joined by South Dakota Attorney General Jason Ravnsborg, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeff Clapper, and Officer John Gross from the Sioux Falls Police Department Street Crimes Division. So we talk about investigating human trafficking. Jason, we'll start with you from the state level as the Attorney General. What tools do you have available to you to investigate trafficking in the state of South Dakota?
Well, I guess the biggest thing is just our trained personnel. A lot of hardworking men and women of law enforcement are investigating these cases on a daily basis, and use of the internet, phones, and tracking. Very vigilant. We have training all year long for them, and just trying to make them better.
And John, on the ground with the Sioux Falls Police Department, has the amount of information that you've been able to share with your people in terms of training, has that gotten better over the last few years?
Definitely has. I mean, there's definitely more awareness, even just within the law enforcement community, about human trafficking. And so it's something that we're training constantly with, just letting our patrol officers know, and then we're constantly getting more information from the public as well, which is helpful.
And so, as we talk about summer in South Dakota, of course, we always talk about the Sturgis Motorcycle Rally, and let's start there. This is a place where a lot of things go on. We see numbers every year about people arrested for all kinds of various things, and trafficking is a part of what happens in Sturgis.
Well, most definitely. In fact, here in the 2019 rally itself, we've had 11 arrests so far in the human trafficking area. And in fact, we had 4 one night here just recently. So, and they're all 25, 35-year-old individual, usually male, seeking 13 to 17-year-old underage, either male or female.
And a lot of these arrests are coming via sting operations?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of stings.
Walk us through that, Jason, and how you set those up, and as many specifics as you can go into.
Right. Well, I mean, in some fashion, they make contact with our person that's alleged to be 13 to 17-year-old, and that's very clearly stated that they're underage, so that they can't claim someday that that was not the case. And they meet up with the alleged person there, and a takedown is instituted. It's very systematic. We have procedures and protocol in place to keep everybody safe, but it is always amazing that these people are in our state, and quite frankly, it's sad to say that all 11 were from the state of South Dakota this year.
And John, I know we're miles away from Sturgis. Do we see an influx in things on this side of the state with people coming through to get to Sturgis?
I would say definitely so. We see that not only just with Sturgis, but with other events throughout the year as well. It seems like if there's more people coming to town, there's going to be more demand for this type of activity. And so any type of large event can mean an influx of this type of activity in our town.
And then, of course, the other big thing will be in the fall with hunting season. Do we see, I mean, obviously it's an extended period of time. Do we see the same sorts of things during hunting season?
Well, we can. Obviously not every year, but yes, there is usually a general increase in the statistics over that time.
And then, John, in Sioux Falls, what kind of operations do we run here in terms of trafficking through the Sioux Falls Police Department?
Sure. With the Street Crimes Unit, we've kind of taken a little bit different approach to how we run our operations. Rather than focusing on the demand side normally, what we've actually gone out is done proactive investigations looking for victims. And so we'll actually look at the online ads and see what kind of activity we have in Sioux Falls. And then on a small scale, we'll initiate a small-scale operation undercover to try to make contact with that female. And prior to that, we usually try to figure out the circumstances a little bit through doing surveillance and seeing, is there a pimp involved, and trying to get that evidence that way first, and then ultimately making contact with the female and hopefully getting a cooperative witness for a case, or a victim in this case.
So in terms of an online ad, obviously someone's not just going to come right out and spell out their intentions in an online ad. What sorts of things, what are some of the key words and some of the key things you're looking for in an online ad that could lead you to believe the trafficking is going on?
I don't want to give out too many specifics.
Sure, right.
But generally, we've gotten pretty good at looking at the ads and trying to determine which ones might have a pimp involved, and usually those are the ones that we'll try to target. As far as, with a pimp, you have a likelihood that there's trafficking with the force or fraud, coercion, and so we've just generally kind of know what to look at rather, and we focus on those cases generally.
With our proximity to two main interstates running through, does that make us more susceptible because there are so many people passing through this community?
I think you definitely can make that argument. We have a lot of people coming through this area, and we definitely heard from people that are coming into our town that this is a place where they can make money doing this, and so there's that supply and demand.
Jeff, let's talk about from the federal standpoint. We've got the city here, we've got the state here. How does the feds, how does it all come together, and what is the level of cooperation, and how much do you have to stick with your own, and how much are you able to coordinate with the state and the local levels?
What we find working at the U.S. Attorney's Office is all our cases are dependent upon the entire law enforcement community, whether it's city, local, the state DCI, the federal law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, Homeland Security, and sometimes even tribal police. These take a lot of effort and resources to thoroughly investigate. We're not just talking about one person that might be trafficked or one perpetrator that might be behind this, but also trying to follow up on the internet clues, the financial trail, trying to make sure all of that works together. And so a lot of the cases that we get start at the street crimes level at the Sioux Falls Police Department, and then work their way through other agencies depending on what type of follow-up is needed.
You mentioned the reservations, Jeff, and the number we have in front of us is 40% of all sex trafficking cases in South Dakota involve Native women or children. So, Jason, again, we've got the state now involved in federal land in terms of the BIA and all of that. How tricky does that become?
Well, I think it can be very tricky at times. Of course, jurisdictional matters are always in question, depending on where the crime happened at. But I think we've made a lot of positive steps this last couple of years, and working with our Native friends. I've actually gone out to a couple of the reservations. They've also come in to see me and Pierre. We're trying to do that outreach. They also had that Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women Act, which was passed by the state legislature. We're trying to implement that and look for people that are in those categories. And this isn't just one category of sex trafficking. It also touches upon other categories such as drugs, especially methamphetamines, assaults, burglaries. Those all tie in together, and I think we have a very good working relationship with our federal and local partners.
You talk about laws, and obviously you need laws to be able to prosecute people. How far have we come, the two folks here, in terms of the legal part of it? How far have we come in the laws that we have against trafficking?
Well, I think we're improving. I think there's definitely a few more areas I think we can improve upon, like labor trafficking. Our laws could be strengthened a little bit there, but I do believe that we have a good working relationship with our federal partners, and in working in conjunction with each other, that sometimes we have to decide who's better to handle the case, either for sentencing purposes or jurisdictional purposes, depending on if it's on a reservation or not.
Jeff, how much stronger have the federal laws gotten recently?
I would say the federal laws have always been strong.
Okay.
Sometimes recently in 2015, Congress reemphasized or added to the law just to make it clear that everything in the stream of commerce of sex trafficking is covered under the federal code. So everything from recruiting somebody to actually being the customer, and anything in between, including harboring, transporting, advertising, whatever, that's included in the federal code for sex trafficking.
And then with federal minimums, and we talk about how South Dakota leads the nation in the number of people who get those federal mandatory minimums. How effective is that as a tool for you to prosecute people?
I think it's very effective. Our courts here take sentencing very seriously. The mandatory minimums are just that. Those are the minimums. We've had a few sex traffickers here that were sentenced to life sentences, multiple life sentences, because of the awful nature of the crimes that they've perpetrated against multiple victims in their cases. So our courts take it very seriously, And because of that, our law enforcement agencies take it very seriously because they know that the courts are going to respect the work they do.
And that is important to the police department to know you've got those laws behind you to back you up when you do make those cases.
Absolutely. And I also find that it helps too when we're talking with a potential victim. One of the biggest things that we have to often overcome is just gaining their trust, that we're not just out trying to arrest them, but we're trying to get them out of a bad situation. And being able to tell them that, you know, these traffickers potentially could serve up to life in prison helps us to gain their trust and help them believe that they can tell us what we need to know and they would still be safe and this person's going to be locked up.
You mentioned the trust issue, John. Is it hard, at least initially, to sometimes convince people that they are actually victims of trafficking?
Yes, as an investigator, that's one of our biggest obstacles to overcome. A lot of times these traffickers, they coach these victims and just tell them, the police are just out to arrest you. If you get arrested, don't say a word to them. I'll bond you out, and then, we'll just move on to the next town. And so it takes some time, and that's one of the challenges of these cases is just overcoming that obstacle, gaining that trust, and a lot of times it just takes time and resources to really work that. Working along with other agencies too, advocates like Call to Freedom can help out with that as well.
We'll have more of our special series on human trafficking in South Dakota in moments. Please stay with us.
Hi, I'm Dr. Shelley Flace with today's tip for kids from the American Academy of Pediatrics. How often does your child say, "I'm thirsty"? For kids, what they drink can be almost as important as what they eat in terms of a healthy diet. I recommend milk with most meals and water in between. A small amount of 100% juice once a day is okay, but save sugary beverages for special occasions. For more information about nutrition, visit healthychildren.org or talk with your pediatrician.
Welcome back to our 5-part series on human trafficking in South Dakota. We continue our discussion of investigating trafficking with South Dakota Attorney General Jason Ravnsborg, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeff Clapper, and Officer John Gross from the Sioux Falls Police Department Street Crimes Division. Jason, because trafficking takes on so many different forms, are there gray areas sometimes, or do things kind of fall in the cracks in terms of enforcement?
Well, absolutely, because sometimes, obviously, you pull a car over, you don't necessarily know what the situation is, and you might be thinking it's in a drug stop initially, and so we've been trying to increase our training for officers to be able to identify, or that victims can feel comfortable in coming forward, because they may not feel comfortable because they are either dependent on the drugs or are afraid in that particular situation. Can the officer identify that it may be more than just a drug stop at that point? But you mentioned a great group, the Call to Freedom. That's here in the East. They actually go in and interdict sometimes themselves, and they're helpful to women predominantly to get them out of the situation. And there's a great group out east, or out west, Freedom's Journey. So we've got a nice set of groups on each side of the state that they're not law enforcement oriented. Maybe they can have a more approachable approach to them that they can trust and build with them. And then there's also one called Native Hope, and that's around Chamberlain area. So our Native Americans maybe feel more comfortable talking to a Native American first. But these groups also get them out of the situation, make sure they feel safe, maybe get them some medical treatment and get them back on their feet. So great groups to participate in, and if people like to get involved, I'm sure they'd appreciate your help.
And Jeff, it does seem like there's a more multi-layered approach now in terms of not just law enforcement and the legal system, but these support systems as well are in place, and that's got to be helpful.
Absolutely. What we find is when you come across a victim of sex trafficking, they're in a environment that's completely unnatural to what the rest of us think of. And so first you have to provide for their safety. Then you have to look for their basic needs, their food, their shelter, their clothing, and then their health needs. Once you get beyond those things, then you're dealing with potential drug and alcohol addiction, maybe some mental health issues, social disassociation from family, friends, support, whatever. It is a multi-layered approach. Law enforcement and prosecution are only equipped to deal with so much of that. And so organizations like Call to Freedom that bring in other agencies that can provide for those different needs and try to get these people back on track to functioning in society the way the rest of us do is essential. I can tell you what we've seen over the course of the time that I've been doing this is law enforcement's taken a different approach. to dealing with victims. They call it a victim-centered approach. Whereas before, a lot of times we find these women involved in prostitution acts. That's a crime.
Yeah.
They're being treated as criminals. But what we find is they're actually being trafficked. When you approach them that way and try to provide for their needs and try to assess where they're at, you get more cooperation from them, which leads to the perpetrators of these offenses being prosecuted.
John, obviously prostitution is something we see a lot of in terms of trafficking in Sioux Falls. Are there other sorts of things in terms of trafficking that happen in Sioux Falls that maybe people aren't as aware of?
Outside of the sex trafficking, that's been the main area that my unit's focused on.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, I do think that there's an element of labor trafficking. However, my unit really hasn't specialized in that, so
Sure.
I would defer to the others.
Yeah, and I was going to say, Jason, obviously being an agricultural state, I mean, there are operations probably all over that can go relatively unnoticed because they're in relatively obscure areas.
Well, they are, and we've had people come forward that they are promised a job or a certain wage, and then they get here, and then they are told that they're not going to get that wage, and they may or may not be legal, and so then they don't want to turn in their employer because they think they'll have consequences themselves. So they take advantage of the situation, and we've got some groups here that are also associated with Call to Freedom and such that are trying to help those people as well.
What can the average person see or do to help you find some of these cases and some of these victims?
Well, I guess I always say if you think that something looks suspicious, alert law enforcement in some fashion, either at the local or federal or state level. And I guess the worst thing that happened is they check out something and it was not a crime. So I guess I'd rather you report it, err on the side of caution, and let us investigate.
That phrase, if you see something, say something. Mm-hmm. A lot of times sex trafficking can look like domestic violence.
Yeah.
It can look like drug trafficking. And I understand why a lot of people don't want to get involved because they're afraid themselves. But having the courage to call the police, call 911, whatever it takes, just to report something can really make a difference in trying to help somebody out and save them from the circumstances they're in.
So, John, with the street crimes unit, do you get tips from people? I mean, is that something that is a large part of what you do, or is it more just what your investigators are uncovering on their own?
We do get tips from time to time, and that's definitely increased. I think as there's more public awareness, we're seeing more and more tips coming in. It's pretty rare still, though, that we actually have a victim just come forward and just tell us that, hey, this has been happening. So we rely pretty heavily on tips from the public and then also our own proactive investigations. We also worked really hard over the last several years of building up relationships with our hotel employees, as they're obviously the first people often to see this type of activity, and just having them recognize that we've got some really good cases that have come from an alert hotel employee that's contacted us, and we've initiated an investigation after that.
And that is a key, because when you read about these cases and happening in Sioux Falls, more often than not, they're happening usually at one of our many, many hotels or motels around. And so just to have those extra set of eyes out there have got to be really, really important. Do you have a coordinated effort where you spend time educating the people at those front desks with either literature or through programs?
We absolutely have. We've distributed pamphlets. We've gone around. We've held a training before for hotel employees. One of the challenges is they're obviously rotating out a lot too, so it's kind of something that we have to keep up on in order to maintain that level of cooperation. But definitely something that we work hard to try to do.
When you're educating those people, especially in a hotel setting, do you find that there's one or two things that you tell them about that surprises them, that they didn't even realize may be a sign of trafficking?
Definitely, I think a lot of them just, a lot of the hotel workers don't want to draw attention to their hotel, and so that's one of the things we just have to build that trust to, and we work with them a lot to let them know that if they do call us about something, that we're not going to flood the hotel with a bunch of squad cars and make a big scene, because that's obviously not good for business. But we give them some tips to look for, things that basically they should keep an eye on and call us if they notice that. And surprisingly, once you kind of know the basic things to look for, it's not too hard to really see it if you're looking for it.
And another one of those more nuanced things is that I see now when those cases are being reported, that whereas in years past the hotel or the establishment would be identified in a media report, typically now they're not.
Yes, if a hotel cooperates with our investigation, we definitely try to keep their name out of the news with everything we can, just because obviously it's not good for their business to have that activity going on. But in reality, it happens at every hotel in Sioux Falls. I mean, any hotel can have this happening, so it's something that they shouldn't be ashamed of, but they should definitely call us, and we try to minimize that so that they don't have that media attention.
We'll have more of our special series on human trafficking in South Dakota in moments. Please stay with us.
Help Medicare beneficiaries in your community and help save Medicare dollars by volunteering with SHINE, South Dakota's senior health information and insurance education program. SHINE is currently seeking volunteers for all volunteer roles. This rewarding volunteer experience comes with in-depth training and support. For more information on SHINE or becoming a volunteer counselor, visit our website at shine.net or contact the SHINE office by phone at 1-800-536-8197. This has been a public service announcement provided by the Department of Human Services Division of Long-Term Services and Supports in partnership with this radio station.
Welcome back to our 5-part series on human trafficking in South Dakota. We continue our discussion of investigating trafficking with South Dakota Attorney General Jason Ravnsborg, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeff Clapper, and Officer John Gross from the Sioux Falls Police Department Street Crimes Division. So where do we go in the future in terms of, on the state level, what do we still need to do in terms of strengthening laws or coming up with additional resources to prosecute these crimes?
Well, I guess additional resources are always helpful. I mean, more cops to investigate, as we, again, have a meth problem as well, and I think they overlap. The governor authorized 4 highway patrol this year and 2 more DCI agents, and we've integrated them into the system already to have drug interdiction, and we also have ongoing classes, as was mentioned earlier about the hotels. We also have classes at the DCI Academy there in Pierre to look into those type of things. But I guess one thing I would add is that there are ways to report stuff anonymously as well. And I guess I'd like to give out the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is at 1-888-373-7888. Now you can call in if you see something, say something, but provide information. You can also text now, and I think it's a really nice, catchy phrase. It's Be Free, BEFREE, which is 233-733. And you can text in if you think there's a situation in progress that you may need some law enforcement attention.
And obviously, as the police department is better trained, I would imagine, especially our highway patrol officers now have to look for any number of things with the things that they pull people over, because it's a busy state and there's a lot of stuff going on.
Well, especially in this time of year, summer, rally time, fair time, I always call August Fair Month. There's lots of moving parts and people going through, and especially I-90 from basically Denver to Minneapolis, Madison corridor, and with our reservations along the way. So there's a lot of activity this time of year.
And Jeff, maybe you don't have the numbers in front of you, but is South Dakota representative of what we're seeing across the country as well? Are we higher or lower, or is this how do we rate? Do we know?
I'm not sure how we rate.
Okay.
But if you were to take the number of prosecutions that we have based on our population, I'd say we're overrepresenting, and that's because our law enforcement agencies, city, state, and local federal agencies all take it real seriously. That's a great thing about the law enforcement community in South Dakota. We're a small rural state. We take crime seriously. We want to keep it that way. We have low crime here. We want to keep it out. Everybody does. So everybody works together. This is a serious problem that's come in from other states. People trying to traffic those people here. They're passing through. Once this kind of came to our attention a few years ago, everybody's gotten on board to try and keep it low, keep it out.
Is there more that can be done in terms of legislation?
Well, I guess there's always a matter of how much you want to strengthen the penalties, essentially. And there's room to improve there, but I do think that the labor trafficking I mentioned earlier is probably the strongest here. We don't have a lot of laws in that area, and I think we're looking at that as our legislative review for this upcoming session, I guess. I did bring along some of those statistics, not necessarily all for South Dakota, but just in 2017, there were 8,759 cases of human trafficking reported, and there's also a hotline or a website for them. It's humantraffickinghotline.org. or polarisproject.org, and you can find a lot of statistics. In those cases, 10,615 victims nationwide with 5,000 potential traffickers were involved. So that's quite a few people to be trafficking people.
And with an agricultural state and the need for labor in this state, that obviously creates a situation where people can be exploited.
Absolutely. I mean, again, very transient, very seasonal at times. Obviously, you always hear about the harvesters that go through from North Dakota all the way down to Oklahoma and Texas. And so obviously they're in our state a short amount of time and then moving on. And as you mentioned earlier, also hunting season coming up with pheasant season. So that's usually a very transient time.
And the thing I'd add to that is that kind of activity is taking place in rural counties where those law enforcement agencies, the sheriff's office, are pretty short-staffed as it is. They're dealing with your normal routine crime. So to find something like this to put in the effort that it takes to investigate these type of crimes is most of the time more than they can handle by themselves.
Did we see any sort of substantial uptick when the oil field boom really began up in North Dakota? Because obviously for a lot of people, they got to go through our area to get there. Was there any correlation between that?
I don't know if there's a substantial boom for South Dakota during that time, but obviously we're becoming vigilant now with the proposed pipeline potentially coming through next year. Again, as was just mentioned by Jeff, a lot of rural areas it's going to go through Harding County, Hawken, where they may only have one sheriff and a couple deputies. Some places don't even have a police department out in those areas. So we're trying to plan and get ready for those scenarios that this might happen in those areas that are more remote.
John, is there more of an opportunity to devote more resources to this on the local level?
I think absolutely. One of the challenges for us on the street crimes unit is we kind of wear many hats. So we're also responsible for gang members and violent crime investigations. And a lot of times other types of crime are more visible or more kind of out in the open, I guess. You know, recently we had a string of shootings on the east side of town, and that was pretty much the main focus of my unit for the last couple of weeks, is we're out trying to deter that type of activity and put those people behind bars. And oftentimes the sex trafficking stuff gets put to the back burner a little bit because it's one of those type of things that if you aren't going and looking for it, a lot of times, then you don't have to investigate it. And so I definitely think there's an opportunity for more proactive investigations in that area, but it definitely takes resources that are sometimes spread thin.
Right, and we talked in one of the previous parts of this series about the overlap sometimes and the substance abuse aspect spilling over into the trafficking part, and whether the trafficking leads to the substance abuse or the substance abuse leads to the trafficking. So there are so many elements, Jeff, involved in all of these.
Absolutely. A lot of the victims that we encounter are vulnerable for a number of reasons, but a lot of those are drug and alcohol addiction, poverty, and so there's multiple facets from a investigation standpoint that come into play, and it also comes into play in prosecuting the cases. When we're dealing with victims that have all these vulnerabilities, these needs I was discussing before, their health needs, their mental health needs, their addiction problems, that's a tough person to work with to get ready for court, to testify in front of 12 jurors to convince them that the person they said perpetrated these crimes is guilty. It takes a lot of work and a lot of concerted or a lot of effort by a lot of different people.
And Jason, I would imagine that having South Dakota get that reputation out there as being a state that is tough on these sorts of things is something you've got to be very, very proud of.
Right. I mean, like has been mentioned, we're a rural state, but we don't want to be. We have a lot of good people, good, honest values, and I think people will turn people in that see it. They just have to be aware of what's going on. And so the more education we can have, I guess, look where we were 5 years ago. We didn't have any of these groups that were helping us. Call to Freedom, Freedom's Journey, I think, and all of state, local, and federal have put a stronger emphasis on it. And I think that we are a tough on crime type state in this area, and I hope that continues and discourages people from participating in this, which I think is just modern day slavery.
This concludes part 3 of our special 5-part series on human trafficking in South Dakota. Special thanks to our guests, South Dakota Attorney General Jason Ravnsborg, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jeff Clapper, and Officer John Gross from the Sioux Falls Police Department Street Crimes Division. I'm Jeff Harkness. Join us next time for part 4 of our series as we focus on the role of healthcare facilities, domestic violence shelters, and local support organizations in identifying and assisting trafficking victims. Thank you for listening.
This has been a special edition of Sunday Focus, a public affairs program of Results Radio Town Square Media, Sioux Falls.